Welcome. I'm excited to have all of you with us tonight for this wonderful presentation that we're going to have. I'm Susan Madsen. I'm a professor of leadership and ethics in the Woodbury School of Business here at Utah Valley University. And I also run a couple of projects for the state. One of them's the Utah Women in Leadership Project, which is the main host for this event. And in that project, we do briefs and events and lots of different things. There's information over here on that. And also the Utah Women and Education Initiative. I run that as well, and that focuses on getting more women in Utah to go to college, to stay in college, and to graduate from college. And so those are my passions. The Leadership Project really focuses on helping girls and women understand that they can have voice and they need confidence, and we need to be out there making a difference in the world. So those are the things that we do. So welcome. Other sponsors of this event tonight are the Women's Success Center here at Utah Valley University and also the Woodbury School of Business. And I'd like to give a thanks to the volunteers you've seen hanging around this event tonight. I appreciate them, and also a couple of people on my team. Bonnie, are you around? Bonnie does so much logistics. She's probably running around. Bonnie and Robin are here. So thank you so much for that. Is she outside? Okay. I also wanted to just mention that all of these, you'll see cameras in the back. We partner very closely with the Utah UEN. It's called the Utah Education Network. And so we film all of our events starting this year, not last year, so that they can be on our website, UEN's website. Chunks are distributed to teachers across the state, people in rural areas, all of that. And just to let you know, I'm going to read these very quick, what videos we have. In September, we had an event. Now, appreciate the title, and many of you were there. Sense and Sensibility, Women and Money. And so Gail Miller, we have a video of her speech, 3 workshops, Show Me the Money for young women, Family Finances Boot Camp, and my favorite title, A Man is Not a Financial Plan. We have an event on there called the Utah Women in Education Forum, which I present on the research that we found in the state of Utah on why women aren't going to college and graduating. We had an event with 4 therapists called You're Good Enough, Embracing Imperfection and Cultivating Confidence. And then our last event, we actually have 3 other videos, one called A Neuroscience Approach to Learning and Leadership Development for Girls and Young Women, kind of talking about the differences between boys and girls and the way our brains work. Another one, A Neuroscience Approach to Transform Your Leadership as Women. And then I met with about 400 young women and did Strengthening Your Confidence as Young Women. So all of those, each of those are videos that you can get to on our website if you missed those events. Some of you look very familiar, and I think you were at those events. And you may have noticed flyers on your seats, and if you, I would say take those and give them to a man so we can get more men. Why men should care about strengthening women. So that's coming up on the 30th of March. So those are our events, and a little bit about our background. And so now I would like to introduce our main person who's going to do our main event. So Valerie Hudson, actually I met in, and I think it was about 2009, and many of you know President Holland, Matt Holland. Matt was a colleague with Valerie, and he just, right when I met him the first time, he just handed me a card and said, "You'll like this lady." So Valerie and I met for lunch, I think, shortly after that, and so we've been friends for a little while. Valerie is I should say Dr. Hudson, but I'm just going to call you Valerie tonight. She's an expert on international security and foreign policy analysis, and her PhD, which she got many years ago, I won't tell you how many, because she's very young. Her PhD in political science. And when I met her, actually, I knew at that time, because President Holland had told me, that she was just named, the foreign policy named her as one of the top 100 most influential global thinkers in the world. So if you didn't know that, I brag about that all the time with Valerie. And Valerie's had a number of books. I won't read the titles to all of them, but she has gotten coverage by Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Financial Times, particularly those for her book on bare branches, which looked at Asia's surplus in the male population. And she's gotten a lot of recognition for her book called Sex and World Peace, but also her latest is the Hillary Doctrine. Both I let my husband come tonight. My husband and I have both read that book too, which is just so wonderful and informative, sad in many ways, but that's reality. So she's also, one of the things that I appreciate about Valerie's work is she's created a national, or nation-by-nation database called the womenstats.org and project that actually is used by countries and the United Nations, the different things that tracks where things are at in terms of women and national security in countries all over the world. So I could say more, but Valerie needs some time. So I will turn it over to Valerie. Thanks so much for being here.
I think the issues that we're going to talk about tonight are some of the most important issues in the world. And I hope that by the time we're through, by the time we have Q&A, and we will have Q&A, I promise you, that you're going to be able to see some linkages that will convince you that what I've just asserted is correct. These are some of the most important issues that we could be talking about. I want to thank Susan Madsen for her invitation. I'm so grateful to her. What she's done with her Utah network and women in education has been nothing short of stupendous. Her energy, her intelligence, her organizational skills, I think have really changed the dialogue here in Utah, and I'm so grateful to her for that. And thanks also to UVU for providing the venue and all of that good stuff. Very happy to be here. All right, well, Susan mentioned that I'm actually a security studies scholar. So in the guns and butter equation, tend to focus more on the gun side than the butter. And yet, as I went through my career studying foreign policy and security, I became more and more convinced that there was an issue surrounding national security, even international security, that we were not talking about. And that issue is the status of male-female relations within the society. Recently, in November, we had a fantastic conference at Texas A&M University where we brought together practitioners and academics and activists to talk about women's situation in the world. Donald Steinberg was one of those. He's the head of World Learning, and he's also a former deputy administrator of USAID. And I was very struck by his quote, and he said, "Compare those societies that respect women and those which don't. Who's trafficking in weapons and drugs? Who's harboring terrorists and starting pandemics? Whose problems require US troops on the ground? There's a one-to-one correspondence. Don't tell me there's no relationship between national security and the empowerment of women." And he is absolutely right. Now, even though he said this just last year, this is not a new concept, that there's some relationship between what's going on with women and what's going on with the countries of the world. I think the United Nations was one of the first organizations to begin to make that link. So, for example, here's a quote from Kofi Annan, who was UN Secretary General in 2006, and he said, "The world is starting to grasp that there is no policy more effective in promoting development, health, and education than the empowerment of women and girls." And then he goes on to say, "And I would venture that no policy is more important in preventing conflict or in achieving reconciliation after a conflict is ended." So you see, moving away from sort of the butter part there, you know, development, health, and education, and beginning to see that there's also a link to guns and butter and what's going on with women. So what I'd like to do for the next few minutes is kind of show you all the facets of this relationship that I see between what's going on with women and what's going on with the nations in which they live. Now, I want to preface my remarks by saying Absolutely, and of course, what's going on with the nation affects women. If the nation's at war, that's going to affect women. If the nation is in a recession, that's going to affect women. But too often we don't look at the fact that this is a two-way street. And so what I want to do tonight is take you on a journey that says, what does what's going on with women have to do with the economics of the country? How does what's going on with women affect the security of the country? So we're going to make it a full two-way street now in our understanding of the world. All right, first facet, I'd like to talk about food security and women. And some statistics are in order to set the stage for that. Women actually produce most of the world's food. This is something that I don't think that we know, because here in the United States, you know, we may assume that large corporations, usually headed by men, are producing most of the food, and that would be correct. But if we look worldwide, it's actually women who are producing most of the world's food. And in fact, in sub-Saharan Africa, women produce 80%. They perform 80% of agricultural labor and over 50% of agricultural labor worldwide. However, interestingly, women only own about 2% of arable land, even though research has shown that children's caloric intake is highly correlated with their mother's property rights. Okay? So you see there a mismatch between responsibility, right, and decision-making on the one hand, and rights. The FAO, in a recent study, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, found that if women farmers were given the same assistance as men in terms of training, in terms of access to seeds and fertilizers, malnutrition would drop 17% globally without any other intervention at all. Okay? That's just a stunning figure to consider. Now, also part of the context is the idea that remuneration for cash crops is almost always given to the men who have legal title to the land. However, study after study has shown that approximately 95% of cash income held by women goes to her family, particularly her children. On the other hand, only 40 to 60% of a man's cash income goes to the family and goes to the children. Okay, once again, a stunning disconnect between responsibility and access to the resources necessary to carry out that responsibility. Also, again, general context, I think some of us even know a little bit about this here in the United States, but in most less developed countries, women are expected to, in essence, work a triple day, right? They're expected to process and cook food, find fuel and potable water, on top of their responsibilities for children, which is all on top of their responsibilities for providing agricultural labor. So one of the greatest deficits that women have is a time deficit. Now, all of us here can relate to having a time deficit, but I ask you to think about what kind of time deficit you would have if you had this kind of triple day, where even going to get the water and fuel for your family would take 5 to 6 hours per day. All right, this is a real time deficit. Furthermore, one of the sad facts about this world that many are not aware of is that when we look at malnourished children, severely malnourished children, 2/3 of all severely malnourished children are female children. And that comes from cultural assumptions about the need for men and boys to eat first and to have better quality calories in terms of protein as versus carbohydrates than women and girls, who often eat last in these cultures. And frankly, to sum it all up, something that we may not understand in our country is that in most of the world, in many agricultural societies, it is women who are responsible for ensuring that women and children do not starve. And men may find it deeply culturally shameful to help their wives, and don't help them, even though study after study has shown in experiments that when men help their wives, there's actually a 30% larger harvest than when women are responsible for doing all the agricultural labor. So I pose the question to you: might inequitable treatment of women make famine and malnutrition more likely for a nation? And the answer is absolutely yes. Right? This is one of those facets we need to see. All right, let's look at economic prosperity. Okay, in a series of path-breaking studies, the World Bank, using their own indicator of the gender gap, right, the larger the gap, the worse the situation of women, found that the larger the gender gap, the lower the GDP per capita of a nation tends to be, as well as having a lower rate of national economic growth. Okay, when you do not reward and you do not unleash the talents and the labor of women, okay, you're going to suffer economically. They also found that lower investment in female education was linked to lower national income, and that makes sense as well. Okay, women come with intelligence, they come with talents, and they come with skills. And if those are left by the wayside and not developed, the society will not prosper as well. They also did what's called a meta-analysis of all of their projects, their development projects over a 10-year period. And the World Bank examined how successful the project was and looked at whether the project had an actual piece, at least a part of the project was devoted specifically to women. And what they found is those projects that did include a gender component were far more successful in hitting their benchmarks than programs that did not. Okay? Just last year, McKinsey and Company, which is I'm sure Susan is familiar with their work, did a series of interesting simulations, and they took what they called a full potential scenario, and they looked at a situation, a hypothetical situation, in which women were participating in the economy at the same rate as men, and they discovered that full potential scenario would add $28 trillion, or 26% to annual global GDP by 2025, compared to a business as usual model. This impact is roughly equivalent to the size of the combined Chinese and US economies today, which is really stunning to think about. They also analyzed a best-in-region scenario in which all countries in a region performed at the same level as the best country in the region. And they found that this would add as much as $12 trillion in annual 2025 GDP, equivalent in size to the current GDP of Germany, Japan, and the United Kingdom combined. So I think we can also ask the question, might inequitable treatment of women make poverty, right, and underdevelopment more likely? And I think the answer is yes. It's another one of those big facets that we're not seeing the linkages here. Now, health in women, that's a linkage I think that many people have recognized in the health field, which is that a linchpin of the level of health within the society is the women, because it is often the women who are providing the on-the-ground, immediate type of healthcare assistance. So again, looking at this gender gap measure, the smaller the gender gap, the lower the infant and child mortality rates, right? So when you empower women, fewer children are going to sicken, fewer children are going to die, because you've empowered their mother, and their mother cares, about their life and their health. The smaller the gender gap, the lower the level of child malnutrition. The smaller the gender gap, the lower the share of household income that's going to be spent on cigarettes and alcohol. So when you give women some say in the decision-making of the home concerning how resources are going to be spent, women tend not to advocate the spending on items that will make one's health even worse than it may currently be. Now, looking at the opposite, the larger the gender gap, the higher the AIDS rate. The larger the gender gap, the higher the infectious disease burden for the entire country. The larger the gender gap, the lower the life expectancy, not just for women, but for men as well. These are fascinating linkages here, and lead us to ask, might inequitable treatment of women make disease and ill health more likely? Yeah, we know that. We absolutely know that. Now we come to some of my own research, which looks at state conflict in women. And some of these research findings are my own, and some are the work of valued colleagues of mine around the nation. What we found in our research, doing a large and statistical analysis, was the higher the level of violence against women, the more likely a nation would be to be non-compliant with international norms and its own treaty obligations. We also found the higher the level of violence against women, the worse a nation-state's relations with its neighboring countries were. In some research that my colleague Mary Caprioli from the University of Minnesota did, she found the larger the gender gap, the more likely a nation-state was to be involved in interstate conflict, in intrastate conflict, what we might call civil conflict, and they were much more likely to use violence first in such a conflict. This is fascinating to think about how household templates of the use of violence expand to societal templates about the use and functionality of violence. The higher the level of violence against women, the less peacefully the nation-state will behave in an overall sense, both external relations and internal relations in the system. Susan mentioned my work on bare branches, and so I've done a lot of intensive work looking at sex ratio alteration. What happens when you cull girls from the birth population through sex-selective abortion or even female infanticide right after birth? And what we found in these in-depth case studies is that we now have some nations that have a 15% larger population of males, young adult males, than females. And this, we've shown, has fueled violent crime rates, instability, and as well as the potential for regional conflict. In fact, I'm presenting a paper on that just in 2 weeks' time. It's a strong association between sex ratio abnormality and instability. So overall, might inequitable treatment of women make conflict more likely for the state? And my research tends to suggest that that's the case. Let's take another facet, governance and women. Again, using the gender gap, researchers have found the larger the gender gap, the higher the levels of perceived government corruption and actual government corruption as measured by local on-the-ground consultants. The smaller the gender gap, the greater the level of trust in government and the greater the transparency in government, which is very interesting to think about that. When the representation of women in these national decision-making councils is higher, all right, they've actually done a comparison of what sort of legislation gets passed. All right, when women's representation is higher, there's greater legislative attention to social welfare, fighting corruption, and improving legal protections for citizens. So the actual policy agenda begins to change when you get more women in the room. Some of the research that Chris Karpowitz over at BYU has done, as well as some of my former students, including Becca Nielsen at Yale, they have shown that when women are represented in negotiations, even peace negotiations, participants are much more satisfied with the outcome, and the agreement is significantly more durable. It lasts a longer time, does not break down quite as easily. So there's something different about including women in decision-making. And so we might say then, might inequitable treatment of government make poor governance more likely? Yeah. Demographics and women. This is kind of a duh, right? I mean, how do you talk about demographics if you don't talk about women? And yet, for a span of almost 40 years, we did talk about demographics without talking about women. But when we look at women, we begin to see some fascinating patterns. So, for example, what we find is when marriage is highly inequitable between men and women, where family law governing marriage is very, very inequitable. What we find almost to a nation is unsustainably high levels of population growth. And this is because women have almost no decision-making power. They have no decision-making power, not just about allocating resources for children's nutrition and health, but we also have no decision-making power about how many children to have and when to have them, all right? Conversely, we find that in more developed societies that make it economically irrational for women to have children by punishing mothers who join the labor force, and we see this in nations such as Japan, but other nations as well, what you find, again, almost to a T, is sub-replacement birth rates. If you make it economically irrational for a woman to have a child, she's a rational actor. She's not going to have children as a result. Lastly, a word needs to be said about the overall global sex ratio. Demographers tell us that if there was no violence against women or sex-selective abortion, what we would be seeing is a global overall sex ratio of about 98 men for every 100 women. And this is because women live longer. They're constitutionally set up to live longer than men, slightly longer. However, my dear young people, something that should have made the front page of the New York Times but did not is the fact that the overall global sex ratio is now 101.4 men per 100 women. And this is not the result of any plague or any sort of natural disaster. This is entirely man-made. We're fond of saying that women are half of humanity, that women hold up half the sky. We are no longer half of humanity. We no longer hold up half the sky. In fact, some research that I recently published, in 2000, there were 5 countries, you could count them on one hand, the number of countries that had abnormal birth-sex ratios because of sex-selective abortion and possibly some female infanticide. Today, 2016, there are 19 countries with abnormal birth-sex ratios, where women's lives are so devalued that to possess 2 X chromosomes is the worst of all possible genetic birth defects. Isn't that amazing to think of that? Absolutely amazing. So, might inequitable treatment of women make demographic problems more likely? Yes, 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 absolutely. So what I would like to suggest here is a retort to some who have said to me, Valerie, the women are but the canary in the coal mine. All right, and you know how in the olden days when mines might fill with noxious poisonous fumes, they would keep a little canary. And when the canary stopped singing and keeled over, they'd know that they would have to leave. All right. And I say, you know, no, women are not the canary. All right. Male-female relations are the coal mine. Right? And the noxious fumes that are produced that are killing those canaries are poverty, malnutrition, ill health, explosive violence, and other problems. This is the conceptual difference wrought by seeing the relationship between what's going on with women and what's going on in their nations. I think Secretary of State Hillary Clinton put it very eloquently in 2012 when she said, the subjugation of women is a threat to the common security of our world and to the national security of our country. Right? And a lot of people attacked her as, you know, this is a total exaggeration. No, 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 it's not. Okay? I think we've seen just how the situation of women, if it's a poor situation, begins to undermine and undercut the progress that can be made within a country. Now, Susan was kind enough to point out that I did write a book called Sex and World Peace. We actually were going to write a book called Sex and War, and then we discovered, kind of ironically, that 2 male researchers had written a book called Sex and War. So we decided to write a book called Sex and Peace, but that sounded like a massage manual, so we decided that we would call it Sex and World Peace, and maybe people would get the idea that we weren't talking, you know, anyway, we tried. But the title has actually not hurt the book at all. In fact, my publisher is just totally thrilled that the book has been extraordinarily successful, and I must tell you how gratified I am that these kinds of issues are now being discussed through the mechanism of this book. In that book, we talk about what we call the 3 wounds that need to be healed, right, in order for male-female relations to become healthier and lead to healthier societies and healthier states. And the 3 wounds that we talk about are the physical insecurity of women, inequitable family law favoring men, and lack of parity in what we call the councils of human decision-making. And we suggest in that book that attention to these 3 wounds, right, will bring about a revolution for the better, not just within our nations, but within the global system. I'm sure that we could spend another half hour talking about all the many facets of these, but I'll simply list them here for you. If we want to talk about physical insecurity, we have to talk about things like sex-selective abortion. We have to talk about higher childhood malnutrition and mortality rates for girls. We need to talk about maternal mortality rates, which, although they have gone down significantly over the first 15 years of the 21st century, are still too high. These deaths are, for the most part, entirely preventable. We would have to talk about pervasive domestic and sexual societal violence against women, where women, I try to tell my students, I say, you know, in a strange sense, being a woman is like being in a war zone. And I say, it's evening time. You want to get into an elevator to go down to the parking lot. There's a man in the elevator. You're alone. He's alone. Do you get in the elevator? No. Okay, let's suppose you manage to get down to that parking lot. It's dark. Your car, right, is a little ways away. What are you feeling as you walk to that car? Where are your keys? Are they sticking out of the knuckles of your hand? All right? When is peacetime for women? When is our peace? Where is our peace if home is actually the most dangerous place a woman can be? All right? I think these are extremely profound questions that we need to be asking ourselves. We could look at rape and sexual assault. We could look at femicide, which has become a plague across Central America and Northern Latin America, the plague of femicide, where women are killed by strangers simply for being women, and their bodies disposed of as if they were trash. We would look at sex trafficking. We would look at honor crimes. We would look at lack of consent in marriage and childbearing. We would look at the plight of widows, which is often terrible and utterly unrecognized within the society. If we were to look at the second wound, that is inequitable family law, I could talk your ears off, all right? I could tell you that how in some societies, women have no citizenship rights, all right? That they actually do not hold citizenship. They adopt the citizenship of either their father or their husband. If their husband is a foreigner, they will lose their citizenship rights within their country. In fact, in many countries of the world, women are legal minors, right? Where they may not have the right to work unless their husband or father gives them permission. They may not have the right to go to school unless they're given male permission. They may not have the right to see a doctor or get a passport unless they have male permission, right? And many nations in the world have this concept of women as legal minors. We've already touched upon women's property rights, but there are many societies in which, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, where if a woman dies, every scrap of marital property belongs to her husband's family, as well as her children. She is nothing unless they deign to provide something for her. And of course, women's ownership of land is a great thorn. Women are allowed often to own what's called mobile property, such as gold bracelets, but if it concerns land, that's got to pass through the patriline, through the father's line. Marriage laws and customs. I mean, I can actually tell you that we have a nation in the world, which is Yemen, that has no minimum age of marriage for girls, where we have girls as young as 5 years old who are married, which is obscene. And we have many other areas in the world where the age of marriage for girls is so low that we can't help but call it child marriage. Other issues, consent. In some countries, a woman does not actually have to appear for her own wedding, right? As long as her father or male guardian shows up, she's married, all right? So lack of consent in marriage, polygamy. One of the things that mires generation after generation in poverty within many sub-Saharan African countries is polygamy, because one man simply cannot support all the children that he sires through all of his wives, and that condemns those children to penury. Patrilocality, where wives go and live with their husband's family, leads to a whole host of ills. Issues of bride price and dowry, which is almost a payment for a girl or to take a girl off one's hands, can aggravate the devaluation of female life. As we've seen, decision-making power, where a man may have all rights to make decisions for his family, is very common. There may even be quote-unquote rights to discipline his wife, which are enshrined in law and may result in beating and other types of assault. We've talked about divorce. Well, maybe we haven't talked about divorce, but worldwide, outside of the developed world, divorce is far, far easier for men than it is for women. A man in some cultures may actually be able to send a text message to his wife saying, "I divorce you." And that's it. She's divorced. All right? No judge has to look after this at all. It's his right and his right alone to repudiate his wife, whereas a woman would have to prove 7 years abandonment, imprisonment for a moral crime, a whole host of things that would be very difficult for her to prove. And of course, child custody goes with the father's line. So a divorced woman may have to surrender her child, usually between ages of weaning and puberty. So somewhere between the ages of about 3 and 12, the mother will have to surrender her child to her husband's relatives. Sex itself. I can tell you there's about 80 countries in the world where marital rape is not recognized as even a valid concept. The notion that a woman has any sort of sovereignty over her own body is considered ridiculous within the context of marriage. Women may have no right to refuse their husband's sex, or to even use family planning to protect herself from STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, or from pregnancy. And of course, there's a clear double standard of marital fidelity that surrounds our world and even permeates the developed world, where a woman may be killed for being unfaithful or being assumed to be unfaithful, whereas a man may be celebrated for being unfaithful and promiscuous as a testament to his manhood. And so these are extremely difficult contexts for a woman to live in, where a woman is seen as a man's honor. And so in many cultures, a rape victim may be killed by her own family because she has dishonored the family name, even though she was the victim. Very, very sad. If we looked at lack of parity in decision-making, well, I guess we could look at Utah, but we won't. I'll avoid offending my hosts. But even if we looked worldwide, fewer than 20% of all national legislators are women. All right, so I know we're not half of humanity, but we're close to half of humanity, and yet there's virtually no places in the world where women are half of the national legislators in their country. Another issue that is an unseen and invisible issue is the fact that what women do in terms of unpaid caregiving or reproductive work is completely excluded from what's called the global system of national accounts. So it does not count as having any value whatsoever, okay? And so all the years that you've put into raising a healthy, hopefully moral and law-abiding child counts for nothing. Any care that you give your relatives counts for nothing. It doesn't matter at all. We often joke, some of you may be fans of Monty Python, and they have this lovely little skit about birth, where, but it's very true. If you're in a hospital giving birth, every single individual in that hospital room will be counted in the system of national accounts as having done something valuable for the economy, except the woman who has given birth. What she has done counts for nothing, nothing at all, right? And of course, does our society even think that a woman who's been an unpaid caregiver deserves any Social Security? No, because she hasn't done anything productive with her life. And I think most of us in this room know that at least the modern American workplace is designed around an archetypal male worker and systematically makes mothers poorer than any other subpopulation. In fact, the greatest risk factor for being poor in old age is to ever be a mother, not a father, but to ever be a mother. And what makes this so stunning is we have reams of research that shows that mixed gender groups make far better decisions than single-sex groups, right? They make less risky decisions when women are in the room. They are more creative and more what's called communitarian, willing to try for a win-win solution instead of a win-lose solution. Participants are much more likely to be satisfied with the outcome, as we've previously mentioned. In fact, a recent multinational survey of 6,500 firms worldwide showed that where women had greater representation on corporate boards, those organizations were less likely to be hit by scandal, bribery, or fraud. Absolutely amazing. So there are real costs from lack of parity in decision making. And so as someone who's in security studies, and who writes about the national interest, all I can tell you is that the national interest is served by the empowerment of women, whether we're examining that national interest in terms of the durability of peace accords, food security, security demographics, national health, national wealth, governance, interstate relations, anything you want to look at. Right? When you empower women, it gets better. When you disempower women, it gets worse. Now, that's Foreign Policy 101, but I want you to know that I know that it's not that simple. So I'm not some sort of, what has one of the candidates been called? I'm not a puppies and rainbow person. Right? This is trench work. This is like the Battle of Verdun in World War I, where half a mile would be gained, and then half a mile would be lost. And you go back and forth over that muddy ground until you prevail. This is, if you want to do something about these issues, you've got to be prepared to be indomitable, right? To be resilient, to be determined, that your voice will be heard and that you will never give up. But I did write a book called The Hillary Doctrine, Sex in American Foreign Policy. The publisher liked that sex part so much that they made us put it in as the subtitle of the book. And you do know that Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State for 4 whole years. And, her doctrine was the subjugation of women is a direct threat to the national security of our country. But what we found in our extensive case study of what was going on is that there were a lot of moral quandaries and bureaucratic quandaries. To speak for a moment about the moral quandaries, one of the issues was that in many countries there's a lack of good alternatives to those in power. And this results in conspicuous silences. To give you but one example, Hillary Clinton was criticized for not saying something to the Saudis about how they were treating women. At least there was nothing on the record, nothing on the public record. But she was probably right. Because I know who's waiting in the wings to take over from the Saudi royal family. And they will be 100 times worse for women than those who are in power right now. So you've got to be careful who you criticize, because they may be the best of the alternatives that you have available. We also have the issue, what I call the blood on our hands issue, where oftentimes U.S. support for women's groups in other countries leads to terrible consequences for those women. The least bad consequence is that they're accused of foreign intrigue. All right? The worst is that they're killed and targeted for killing because they have been supported by the United States. Let me give you an example. Last fall, for those of you who are foreign policy wonks, you may know that the Taliban briefly retook the city of Kunduz in Afghanistan. And it was just a stunning shock. The Taliban was asserting that it had the military power to take back a large Afghan city. All right, so they only took it for 3 weeks before they were ousted. But what we now know is that the Taliban came into that city with printed lists of women that their fighters were commanded to track down and kill. And these were all of the women in Kunduz that the Americans had funded. Ouch. Now, many of them fled, many of them got away. But the idea that by empowering women, we sign their death warrant, I think is a very sobering thing. Third, I think you're probably aware, most of you are Americans in the room, that the US has this proclivity for using military instruments to solve problems. It's a problem in Libya, let's go bomb it, right? Well, you know, and there's a lot of reasons that we do that. And part of the reason is that in terms of instruments of state, we have definitely honed that military instrument. We have poured so much money into that instrument that it seems like the natural go-to idea. But let's face it, you know, you want to ask a tough question? Are women safer in Iraq now than they were under the dictator Saddam Hussein? No. No. If you ask any Iraqi woman, she will tell you that they lost 100 years of progress when the Americans invaded. That's sobering also. And then the issue of kind of our own house, right? There's a lot of people say we're pretty hypocritical. We're like, I think we're now just one of 2 nations in the world that have no paid maternity leave, and we're out there championing women's empowerment. You know, that's a pretty uncomfortable position. We haven't ratified CEDAW. Only 20% of our national legislature is female. We have significant levels of violence against women. Yeah, it's tough not to feel like a hypocrite out there promoting the empowerment of women when we've got issues at home. Bureaucratic issues. To be perfectly honest with you, and actually Holly Richardson and I were just talking about it. In the first wave of trying to affect change, women and gender became a pet rock, right? What I mean by that is, oh, what a pretty nice pet rock. Oh, women are so important, aren't they? Yes, yes, let's have another meeting about that. And then the going gets tough, and Holly needs endorsements. And where are all of the enlightened men who talked about the importance of women? All right. One US official actually said, as far as women's programming in Afghanistan is concerned, all those pet rocks were weighing down our rucksack. One can only hope that this is a generational issue and that subsequent generations will take this issue more seriously, but there's a lack of will at the top. There's also a lack of hard targets. So let's suppose that you think it's important to have women at peace negotiations. Where's the hard targets to hit? We don't have them. Okay? The US itself has no female negotiators at the Syrian peace talks. The US, right, not only has no women of its own at the peace table, it has not insisted that there be any Syrian women at the peace table. So unless you match the rhetoric with hard targets, nothing's going to change. It's all going to be hot air. And lastly, we have a problem with implementation on the ground. Some of the people who were implementing gender programming on the ground in places like Afghanistan were subcontractors of subcontractors of subcontractors who not only couldn't care less about gender programming, right, in terms of ignoring it, but actually undermined it. Visited brothels, set up their own brothels. All right, and these were our subcontractors who were implementing the Hillary Doctrine on the ground. So we can't be Pollyanna-ish about this, right? We know it matters, we know it's important, but we're going to have to be smart in order to be effective about it. So the kinds of questions I think we need to be asking at this point, and of course it's a little bit depressing because when I look at the presidential campaign, well, let's not. So we should be asking questions, you know, of ourselves and of our presidential contenders. What does a state foreign policy that takes women seriously even look like? What's our responsibility towards the women of Afghanistan as we try to draw down an exit there? Given our experience over the first 15 years of the 21st century, what kinds of recommendations would we give to the next president-elect? I think these are the pressing questions now, and I lament the fact that there's not a snowball's chance in Hades that anyone's going to be talking about it before November 3rd. I want to leave you with a couple of concluding thoughts, and then I hope that we can do some Q&A. I'd like to tell you that I've been studying these issues for a quarter of a century, and I have come to a very, very deep conclusion, and that is there cannot be peace on earth until there is peace between men and women. There cannot be peace between nations until there is peace between men and women, until those three wounds are healed. And I believe that the roots of many things that we value, such as democracy and human rights, those things come organically from the nature of male-female relations in our households. You want real, sincere democracy in your society? Well, then you'd better cultivate it between the men and women in their households. You want human rights in your society? Well, you better cultivate it between men and women in the households of your society, all right? You can't get there anywhere else. You can't veneer, all right, a dedication to democracy and human rights over incredibly inequitable and exploitative male-female relations. Can't get there from there. So, tonight, that means that we can have one of the most important discussions of all. And if you'd like to know more, feel free to go to our website, womanstats.org, with an A, womanstats.org, and check out our data, our maps, our graphics, our research, and we'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much.